Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the QRL Show, the place where you come for the crypto and stay for the quantum. Myself and Michael Strike from the QRL team are joined by Anastasia Marchenkova, who is a quantum physicist, an engineer. She's been involved in quantum, building quantum computers. She creates a lot of in-depth content across the board, ranging from YouTube to working and consulting with people on the business side, the areas of crypto and quantum in a number of areas. So we're really excited to have her on our show. Anastasia, before we jump into any of the questions in the conversation today, it would be really good to just let you touch on for a minute or two, do your background justice and kind of give us a little intro for those of you who aren't aware of your background.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Finally glad we got to do this. We've been corresponding for a while over email. So, yeah, where do I start? I've been in the quantum technologies for almost 15 years now. So that's quite something actually in the field, right? Everyone's talking about the hype the last few years, but I actually started back in 2009 in my undergrad doing research on neutral atom quantum memories and long distance quantum telecommunication. And I always joke that nobody cared about quantum at the time. It was just, us in the lab doing this research. And then in my senior year of my undergrad, I actually crashed the servers at my university with
This was at
one of my
Georgia Tech.
friends at Georgia Tech. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were always so on about like, we have the third best internet in the country besides or the second best besides, the Pentagon. And we took it down. So that was pretty great. And at that point, a professor in the computer science department found out about us. He was founder of a company called Numbala. And he basically was like, that was amazing. Here's a check for seed funding. You should start a company. And didn't think I'd do that. I wanted to become a professor. My dad was a physicist, so I thought I'd go in that track. So I did that for a little bit. It was not in quantum as educational technology, but education had always been so deep to me. That's how my family came to the country, and my dad was a postdoc at Berkeley. And so did that for a little bit, sold the company, and then didn't know what I wanted to do. Back for my PhD. I'd already gotten accepted and just deferred admission at University of Maryland at the Joint Quantum Institute. A lot of good programs there, a lot of trapped ion research going on. I stayed there for about a year and a half, and I realized the pace of graduate school was not for me, and I wanted to do something more. And at that point, I'd already started blogging a little bit. I just got tired of answering the same question over and over. And because I was living in DC at University of Maryland, it was a lot of questions around the security aspect. Cryptocurrency was starting to become a thing, and I was getting these questions, and I was like, well, I should just write it down because I'm tired of explaining this. And I realized there's really no content in the middle ground. There was a lot of pop science content that was just wrong, and there were a lot of academic papers. So I really wanted to write in the middle. And so Medium had just come out a few years before that, posted a few articles on there. They did pretty well for, pretty technical articles. I think it was like 20, 30,000 views in a week on quantum. And I was like, well, that's way more people that will ever read my thesis. So, something else going on. And then, yeah, after that, I realized I just wanted to do something different. And I discovered a company in California that just finished Y Combinator called Rigetti Quantum Computing. And at that point, I was one of the few people in the world with quantum and startup experience. So even though I didn't have the PhD, they hired me to join at a very early stage. I was employee number 4 over there, moved out to California. And then, later on, we decided that we thought we disagreed a little bit with the approach on building the hardware and started Bleximo, which is building application specific quantum processors. So actually adjusting the chip itself, the design to the algorithm that it would run. We joke, we're like, well, quantum computers are kind of like GPUs, right? So we'd want to build it like that. That seems the direction we'd want to go in. And yeah, in the meantime, startups don't get funded immediately. So I spent some time doing some work in high performance software engineering, R&D algorithms, enterprise sales. I just kind of wanted to keep both my skills up in terms of talking to people and on the science side. So I've had my hands in quite a lot.
Yeah, no, thanks for filling us in. I feel like it's a lot. You not only went into the deep end on like the startup side, but also have the technical understanding. And then if you triangulate that with you putting out content, I feel like one of the only ways to really get good at content, whether it's written form, whether it's video, is put something out in the world and see how it resonates with people. And I think that probably that's like the ultimate litmus test to see, oh wow, this is actually striking a chord with a lot of people, which kind of jumps into what my first question was going to be. But before that, Michael, can you just you're along with me on the call here, and I think it would be good to give just a quick sense of where we come at the conversation from, and then I think that would lead nicely into our conversation around quantum today.
Yeah, I'll just run through. Most of the community knows what my background is. I'll just run through that quick. I call it my classical background is network engineering, network design uh, for over 20 years. Route switch, firewall, process improvement. That that area of IT. I'm a hardware guy. But I've done a lot of network programming for Fortune 500 companies and rebuilt DMZs. That's all my classical stuff that I've been doing forever. Now, I call this my non-classical career because it's at this tiny little singularity of intersection of quantum and blockchain, right? A very specific niche. Uh, I first heard about Bitcoin in probably 2011, I think. And I had first heard about quantum computers in 1997. I remember the conversation. A friend and I were talking about, he was explaining special relativity to me, and I thought it was incredible. And he brought up quantum computers, and then we were also talking about 3D information cubes we were supposed to have by now. I actually haven't looked into those lately. So that was quite a while ago. And I maintained my interest in blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And while I was went through my classical career, I started to do a lot of investigation for myself on the quantum side. Really trying to get down to the bottom of what makes reality reality. Of course, like in many people that go into quantum mechanics, I ended up with more questions than when I started. And then I started to realize that reality is just basically a construct of mathematical functions that technically don't exist. That silly little observer problem. And I went down that rabbit hole as far as I could. And then I just started to have to end up with my own specific views and my own interpretations of what's actually happening. And I kind of landed there. So maybe we could either talk about the different interpretations, or we could stick to blockchain. We'll see where you guys want to go. But most of the community knows me already. So yeah. So well, go ahead and lead us in, Ryan.
Yeah. So I think as like a starting one, I think you've covered this a little bit, Anastasia, in some of your recent content, but a good question to start out, and one that obviously can be answered in a number of different ways depending on who you're talking to. But one thing that you really live at a nice central place of quantum with tech and producing digestible content around that. And so you understand the technology, but importantly, you understand how to share it well, so that if it's a junior CS major that has just gone down the rabbit hole last week, or maybe someone's, a suit in New York City and they're like, I don't know, people are talking about this technology. Where should I go to learn about it in a non-dry type of content way? You're good at like intersecting those two. So I kind of just want to start out with a question, of could you cover for those type of people that are just getting introduced to post-quantum cryptography, what would you tell them if you were sitting down in a room with them on why now is like the right time to take notice of it, and like in a non-fud way, just more of like a matter of fact, however you like presenting it to people? I think that would be helpful for a majority of people that are viewing this.
Yeah, it's funny. I tweeted this morning a comment. I have people that believe that quantum is never going to become a thing, and this is all stupid. Why should we be doing PQC? And I have people in my comments calling me stupid because they say the government has a quantum computer already for 30 years and everything's been broken already, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, my number one to everyone is saying it doesn't matter whether you believe quantum computers are going to be here tomorrow or in 10 years. The government is saying that they're releasing standards next year and you have to upgrade. That's it. In the end, you don't have to believe anything, right? But in my end, I've also seen kind of the progression over time of the quantum space. So, there has been a little bit of a joke of like Shor's algorithm is said to break encryption, and we've been saying it's 10 years away for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
But it's starting to get to the point where, at least on my end, because I talk to a lot of these quantum companies and I see it, we're working on either end of the spectrum, right? So we're working on building the hardware up, and that is increasing slower than we expected, of course. As you know, scientists are actually very optimistic people. People don't think that. But also, we're working on the other end of the error reduction. So it's a really interesting thing. So you're kind of looking at these kind of curves and going, you know, 10 years ago, John Preskill, in his interview, Caltech lecture, says it's going to take 10 million qubits to break this encryption. And you go and you look at the quantum computers today, 100 qubits, 200 maybe, and you go, we're nowhere close, right? But then you see the papers being released like, oh, we could potentially do this with 100,000. Okay, that's already interesting. Those are orders of magnitude lower,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Another order of magnitude can maybe, what happens if that happens in the next 3 years, and are we going to maybe 10x the qubits in the next 3 to 5 years? Well, then that's very close by. Another thing I always say to pay attention to is, I don't believe that quantum computers exist right now. I don't think the 30 years of the government thing is legitimate. However, it's going to take a very long time to upgrade these systems. So even if it's 10 years away, I'm very concerned actually about legacy players in the space, right? Like
Yeah.
old financial institutions. I mean, even in my university, I remember we were trying to sell them a product and they're like, well, the system is built in COBOL.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there being like, and they're just like, we don't know how to change it, right? Like, we don't know what to do. So think of all these legacy financial systems, defense, all these communications. It's going to take a long time to upgrade. And that's
Yeah.
why it's not like you have to upgrade tomorrow or all your Bitcoin are going to be stolen, but like start thinking about it, start looking into it, start making plans if you're a business. And especially with the government mandates probably coming up soon, if you are working in any sort of defense and government agencies, you will have to comply with these standards.
Yeah, that segues really well into my next question, which is just as you said, like whether it's legacy institutions, big companies, if we picture them as being big ships that they can't move on a dime, you also spend a lot of time consulting with different businesses. So whether you're talking to, I don't know, a CISO at a Fortune 500 company, or you're talking to any other C-suite person at a notable organization, have you noticed, whether it's over a longer arc of time or even more recently, have you noticed any commonalities or patterns in what they're responding back to you in terms of, why they can or can't make moves in terms of preparing and being proactive for post quantum security? Because I think it's one thing for someone to, if someone takes the step of talking to you, talking to other individuals, to try to first off educate themselves on it. And then from there, okay, we have the insight. What can we do with it now? But there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape within these organizations of, even if they want to do something, maybe they then go to their IT and, within their infrastructure, and their security team says, hey, that's nice and great in theory, but there's no way we're going to be able to do that. I feel like there's a lot of constraints within it. So what have you noticed in terms of these conversations? I'm sure a lot of people, just much like with AI today, a lot of people want to be proactive, but what are some of the same bottlenecks or things you see that have been patterns across the board?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the big ones is education, right? And I think that's why my content does pretty well, because there's only a few people out there doing this sort of thing and having those
Yeah.
conversations. And then they actually, like, you're right, they reach out to me and they're like, hey, I saw your content. Here's my org. Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
conversations are really, I live in Silicon Valley, right? So you have a lot of very, like, tech heavy companies that are very early on, very agile.
Yep.
In these big companies, you really take a step back and it becomes an education aspect, first of all, of like, what can this actually do? Where are you worried? And yeah, where do I even start? I think is
Mm-hmm.
a big concern that these companies are having. And they are worried about the slowness and the pace of, their org potentially.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's a lot of, I mean, I think there's concern there, but people don't know what to do. There's a holding pattern, right? And one of the issues I've seen, and I say this right now, cryptocurrencies are looking at the same thing, where we're kind of waiting for NIST to make a move. And beyond that, until they make a move, you're kind of in a holding pattern, right? Why would you spend all this time upgrading a system to a random one where it might not be NIST compliant if you are a government vendor? So everyone's kind of waiting for someone else to make a move
Yeah.
and figure it out.
You
But
don't,
that's
you
why,
don't want to be that person inside an organization that makes the wrong move, and then you losing your company tens of millions of dollars, and not only is their job on the line, but it also just steers the company in the wrong direction. So
exactly. And, how do we mitigate that risk? So, what I've been seeing Ethereum put out a roadmap for quantum resistance. They're looking into it, but not big actions. Google actually in Chrome has released a hybrid system. So, I think that the orgs that are moving forward, and I've seen this from the conversations, are saying, okay, let's at least take a hybrid approach in that we're encrypting with a quantum resistant algorithm and one of the old classical algorithms, and then the security is just, if one's broken, and we have had that, right? One of the finalists at the NIST competition for PQC was broken over a weekend with a laptop. So that is a concern, right? But if you're encrypted with both, it's kind of like you have the security of the strongest one in place, right?
yeah,
So that's what they did. And I think that's what's going to be the key here. And in terms of prep, when I'm talking to businesses, I say, let's make a let's just make a map of like everywhere that you need to plug. What vendors, are you using that are using bad encryption? Where is it internally? Do you need to hire people that know COBOL again to fix this? Like, what do we need to do to actually make this happen? So maybe next year, or again, you have a DARPA contract, they call you up and they're like, we're not giving you money until you fix this. Like, we have an action plan. But beyond that, it's kind of starting in the education space and making the roadmap. And then a third issue I kind of see is just having the talent. There's not a ton of talent in the space right now. And that's why the education piece also comes back and becomes really important, because people need to understand this. And it takes a while to kind of step back and think about this new way of computing, because it's not something that we don't experience it in day-to-day life. We don't have that intuition of quantum in our day-to-day. So you kind of have to sometimes accept a lot of things on faith. And even I said I've been in the lab, like I've done these experiments with my own hands, I've seen the results, I know it works, but then sometimes I think about the why.
yeah,
And I go a little bit too deep, I go into an existential crisis, and then it goes like too much, and I'm like, okay, what can I actually know in this universe, right? Like, you can go to super determinism, all those other things, but what do I know in this universe that's true? What have I seen experimentally that works? What does the data show? The other things are scary and kind of weird, but I have no control over them, so I need to kind of look at the subset and kind of bring it back to that. So
yeah.
there's a lot to do. It's a weird one, and I even work with startups looking for investors. It's the same issue, right? You don't have to just convince the investor that this will make them money. You have to convince them, like, here's, quantum science. I need to somehow teach you that
Yeah.
before we even get to that next
And
part.
yeah, you not only need to paint them on the billion-dollar vision, you also need to give them, without going down a rabbit hole of putting their mind in a pretzel, touch them on that. You have to touch them on, okay, what's the beachhead of where you'll get it in, especially when we're talking hard tech, when it's going to take a lot more money too. We're not talking about like a B2B SaaS play where, hey, we can get profitable in this amount of time, this is our clear MVP. It's like we're talking about hard tech that can take years to build out, maybe even more.
I've got so many thoughts, Anastasia, based on what I agree with you on a lot of those points, and I'm thinking about my classical career, and I think that in COVID did not help this, but I think that there's this imposter syndrome that a lot of people suffer from, particularly engineers, although they'll never admit it. And I think this can create insecurity. And I've never seen someone walk up to the CISO department, the security department of a corporate or a Fortune 500 organization, and say, "Hey, what do you think about this quantum security?" Because right now, some people are afraid. I mean, for example, if you go on LinkedIn and you see posts and you see people that are really responding to things that they're comfortable with, that they know are absolutely true, And then you see a very small portion of that are free thinking, and they're actually posting their real ideas, but they get less responses, even though their posts are more original. And I think that's because these are strange times. People are risk averse, and it takes a lot of courage to put your professional self on the line of something like quantum computers when you have arguments that there's calculations being done in other multiverses, right? And I don't know if Marvel has brought more awareness to quantum, or if it's done more harm. I don't really know for sure, but I know that there's no entry level, mid level, and probably not even a lot of senior level engineers that are going to the security department and saying, "Hey, this is quantum." I mean, we're not quantum secure in these areas, and a lot of what we've been talking about is Moscow's theorem, right? That's a lot of what we've been talking. How long do you need encryption to be secure? How long will it take to implement? How long do you think it will take to implement large scale quantum solutions in your organization? And how long will it take to develop a large scale quantum computer or any other significant development? If the first one plus the second one is greater than the third one, then it's time to worry, right? So these are difficult times. These are difficult topics to approach in a difficult period of of human history, I guess. I think so. So I think there's economic, social reasons, and I'm going to be completely honest. IT organizations aren't as good as they were 5 years ago, pre-COVID. I see more outages. I see more outages statistically than I used to, be it my power grid or be it my ISP or even just the operational stuff, the stomping up the fires of the day-to-day stuff. I've seen more, and while the workforce is probably has as we've tried to adapt to a remote lifestyle, there have been some costs to that. So all of these, I think, weigh into the quantum selling point. But the closest thing I've been able to do is to get someone to relate to it is, hey, is to think about Moscow's theorem. So even if there's, let's say you even think there's like a 3% chance, maybe you should be putting 3% of your yearly budget into at least researching this and understanding it. Don't think about me. NIST has already been working on this for years, and the federal government, based on where's my bookmark? Had their Biden signed the quantum readiness initiative, right? Which saying, hey, as a government, we've done this research. You can believe or you cannot believe, but that's not the question. The question is, do you want to take the chance? And the spin up time this is not like Y2K where everyone knows the COBOL code, right? This 3, and you have to be able to handle 4 digits instead of 2. This is a fundamental level understanding. In some degree, you don't have to go down into the quantum mechanics to be able to code upgrade, but you have to know enough to understand that it's fundamentally different. It's just completely different. It's a different way of thinking, and it's not organic for us to think in these ways, because all we see is all of the wave functions already collapsed around us, and this is our reality, right? So a few thoughts of mine.
One question I think would be good to go into coming out of that is, you mentioned that a lot of people, when it comes to quantum, some people don't even know where to start, or it's, even if you talk to people, well, where do you even find people that are want to work in the industry? When it comes to the next, say, 2 to 5 years to come, you've been involved as both a practitioner and you have been involved on the startup side, in the side of, research, the academic side. One part I think would be good to touch on is, what's exciting you most for the next 2 to 5 years to come? Is it, hey, is there a lot of bright young minds coming out of alum like Georgia Tech? Is it other people that you're seeing in Silicon Valley that you're like, wow, they're working on a few things? And the reason I want to touch on this with someone like you is, news headlines start to look the same every single day when it comes to the quantum threat, progress quantum computing companies are making. And the reason is because, we live in a clickbaity news type of industry. Oh, China has cracked the code of quantum supremacy. But you as a practitioner, you actually have a really, practiced take on this. So I'd love to hear where are you most excited in terms of two parts, both the people that are building and young people that are getting involved, and then also maybe even on the what's fact from fiction a little bit. So
Yeah, it's interesting as a content creator, right? Because in the end you're kind of like, well, I want more views, and I see the videos that are going viral and I'm like, it's wrong, right? Like even the news ones, this company has 1,000 qubits and I'm like, yes, but, right? So I'm kind of the party pooper in some ways, but it's like there's so little fundamental understanding of the field, right? That people kind of escalate this whole thing, and the media really needs, I mean, in general, for everything, I think the media has just jumped the shark completely, right? So I am excited in the next 2 to 5 years. I mean, on the education side, there's a lot more programs coming out specifically for quantum. That's interesting to me in terms of there's some arguments online, on Twitter. People are talking about this. Is this really good for the world, right? It's kind of like you're being trained for a trade. And what if this doesn't end up happening, right? You're going to have a lot of people with worthless degrees. The thing is, physics has always been, I studied physics. My degree was in physics. Physics just helped me think about the world in a different way. So that was applicable to everything, and I kind of went in and I took a software engineering job and I had no CS degree. I knew how to code, but physicists are good coders, they're horrible software engineers, and I want to be a software engineer and learn how to actually build a scalable system, right? But I knew from physics that I could always learn something new. So I don't think those degrees are going to be useless. I took some time and did some deep learning, right? And I was like, oh, the math I learned on the quantum side can be applied to deep learning. So people who are arguing like this is a bad idea, trades are, because these people might not have jobs. I don't think that's fully legitimate. I'm
yeah,
excited that people are finding a path into physics, because I think I went to University of Georgia Tech, and I think it was one of the biggest undergrad physics programs, and it had 25 people per year,
yeah,
right? It's tiny. So having more people actually come to the fundamental sciences, I think, is going to be really strong just for the world in general. Um, in terms of the actual technology side, I really think in the next, I mean, I hope, it depends on how the talent. I also see like the talent is getting a little bit exhausted, and even I have that some days, where I'm just like, I've been working on this 15 years and it's not quite there yet, and I'm just tired and I want to build something that actually like people use today.
yeah,
Um, so I'm a little worried about some of that talent getting tired and leaving, actually. But I hope that, because there's a lot of interest, and, you mentioned the movies, the Marvel Quantum Realm. I love Marvel. People are getting excited about it and getting those young people into it. Hopefully that means the talent stays in and we can actually get to the point. And I really, really think that in 3 years, we will have a real problem that can be solved by quantum computers faster than a classical, like a real problem that actually has business uses.
yeah. Business
Um,
use case. Yeah,
yeah, business use case. And my worry there, when I say that now, is like, if I last year I would have told you for sure in 3 years, but now as I'm seeing some of the talent leaving, I'm like, 3 years might be interesting. But again, I don't know everything going on in every field. There's a lot of countries that are very quiet about it and are doing really well, and that news is coming out. So I'm still pretty excited about that time frame in terms of actually having a real business problem.
yeah. No, thanks for covering that. I think it would be good coming out of that. It would be good to go into a few questions around cryptography, around quantum computing, and get a little bit more into the weeds on that side. And I think that whether someone who's viewing this is newer to learning out the space, going down the rabbit hole, or they've been around for a bit, I think it'll be applicable for both of them. So, Michael, it'd be great if we covered a few of these, and we'll see where it leads.
Let's talk about. I had a couple other questions that were previous to what you were talking about. Um, okay, so qubits, right? You've got different types of quantum computers. You got these trapped ions, and you've got even photonic quantum computers. It's this whole systemic. One of the biggest problems is this systemic noise. I think dilution refrigeration's gotten like pretty close as much as it's gonna get, trying to bring things down to zero Kelvin, they've gotten really, really close, scarily close. But essentially, the problem is you're trying to take something and separate it from causality of the universe. Is kind of the way that I explain what a qubit is and how difficult it is. So as far as like what are you most excited about as far as quantum computers? If assuming you're excited about any of them, would it be like maybe we can resolve this systemic noise issue with by more insulation, colder temperatures, or should I say less hot temperatures? What about our qubit manufacturing? The manufacturing process improvements, algorithmic improvements potentially. Where do you see kind of, or add a few? Where do you see kind of like the next generation of innovation coming from?
Yeah, definitely. And non-answer, but I'll go deeper into each one, is all of them, right? So starting from the hardware, this is something I've talked about a few times, and actually talked to a few other people in the field. As a startup founder, people don't really say that, but I think as a scientist, people think this in their head. And with this conversation, we have it. I think the different types of hardware will all be used for kind of different things in the quantum space. So we're seeing that maybe some sort of modality of qubit, like whether superconducting, might be better used for specific use cases. Photonics might be used for different use cases. So all of them can win in a certain way, right? So I'm excited about that because it seems like that narrative is shifting a little bit into that end where we're seeing because this all connects to how do we actually scale this up? Because you're right, the refrigeration units, the dilution fridges, you get one off the rack, it goes down to 8 millikelvin, pretty good, right? You can continue cooling, but there's a lot of other things actually you have to think about. RF crosstalk, right? So it's like if you put components too close together, you're going to have crosstalk, electromagnetic crosstalk there. Put them too far apart, like there's control issues, right? Like there's a lot of extra things, and we're also running up against a limit soon of how many qubits can the fridges actually control at once, right? So there's this whole idea back in the day, people say like, well, a chip this size could have 10,000 qubits on it. The problem is in a superconducting system, each qubit is controlled by 2 wires. So when you're putting those in, you're like, I don't have room for 20,000 wires going in. And these are not, like our iPhone wires. They're very, very big wires and very expensive wiring. So the next phase is, something we had been working on is can use a photonic chip to actually control the superconducting chip. You're like, that's interesting. So we're starting to combine these technologies together. And then you just need one RF signal wire to go in there. I know some companies have been working on, okay, how do we make 1,000 qubit fridge? They're starting to run into issues, there as well. And can we really go beyond 1,000 on the fridge? Okay, so then what's the next level for scaling? What are we going to do? There's conversations around, making these modular systems. So maybe you just have logical qubits, one fridge is one logical qubit, and you combine a bunch of these fridges together into logical qubits. And then you don't have to scale one, refrigerator up to, 1 million qubits, 10,000 million qubits. You have to figure out a way to make this modular, which then changes kind of the algorithmic approach, right? So there's a lot of interesting research going on there. No one has an answer yet for certain. I mean, there's a lot of research going on about it. I told you a little bit about the photonic superconducting that we've been doing. IBM and Google are building 1,000 qubit fridges right now, so they're going in that direction. And then, people are still exploring new modalities, right? Because also the idea is, okay, so you have a quantum computer, but then you want to send it over a long distance. How are you going to do that? Well, we do need photonics for that as well. So we have to connect them in some way. So a ton of stuff going on there. And that affects everything on the way up. Firmware. I mean, there's so much opportunity in the space right now to just get into it and contribute because every piece is kind of so like in the 70s, right? Is like the middleware, the firmware, the higher level stuff. There's so much to do.
Yeah, I agree. So it does feel a lot like the 70s. I did hear one way to kind of help trying to overcome some of the scaling issues would be having different quantum computers running in different areas of different organizations, different areas of the world and they'd have to be synced together classically, but being able to maintain the superposition somehow in an optical internet, which that gets into the quantum repeaters, which I still don't understand how those things would be manufactured, because on the inside of a piece of fiber, for example, you actually, let's say you have a straight piece of fiber, even if it's a laser, it's still bouncing around in the fiber like this, because light is going to go in a straight line, general relative outside of general relativity, a straight line through the fiber, right? So how are they gonna not how does the photon not collapse the outside of the sheathing of the fiber optic cable? So all of these scaling issues just bring up a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. I don't necessarily. I liked your answers. I just wish I had. I wish I had a better answers or other suggestions, and I just don't. We just don't know. We just don't know. I, I think there might be some. If I had to pick, I think the refrigerators have gotten as good as they're going to get, probably. Um, I don't know, maybe building a dilution refrigerator inside of a dilution refrigerator. I don't know. Maybe someone will come up with a crazy idea like that and be able to improve it. But
Strike, do you want to go into? I know you had a question or two around one on NIST and then one around benchmarking, whichever one you want to cover.
two questions. I kind of view a quantum computer with something with a lot of secrecy, a government-funded program. I've said this before, like a Manhattan Project. Okay, something that has to remain compartmentalized, because you're talking about, in a lot of ways, you're talking about national security. So again, let me rephrase. Let me ask my first question. Do you think that there are stronger, more capable, powerful quantum computers that exist today that are far beyond what we think that already exists? And if so, why? Or if no, no.
I don't think so. I mean, I see the money being put in. I see what the departments are putting in. I've seen the labs being based in DC. You open a door and you're like, oh, that's a NSA funded project. I'm probably not supposed to be here. And you kind of walk the other way, right? And there's some countries that have been a lot really ahead of the US on certain technologies. So China has always been leaps and bounds ahead on quantum communication. So they have that, they are pouring a lot of money into the projects. But recently we actually saw that Alibaba shut down their quantum program.
Yep.
So we're seeing that. So, if they had a quantum computer, I don't know. You can kind of think about, well, maybe the government does have one and the management there found out and they're like, well, this is useless. Like maybe we'll shut down that research, right? Like that could be a possibility. But you see what the countries are doing. They're pouring a lot of money into it, right? In all sorts of ways, into startups, into bigger companies all over the place. So they're kind of spray and pray. So if they had it, why would they be doing it unless it is a giant conspiracy on top of that? But yeah, I don't think so. It's just there's a lot of unanswered questions. So I feel like we would have found out. Keeping that quiet would have been hard. Where are those scientists coming from if they did have, such a strong team? The quantum space is pretty small. We kind of, if someone disappears all of a sudden and says like, "Oh, I can't tell you where I work," and there was a significant number of them, we kind of figure that out. Again, talking about the US and Europe and countries where we have good relationships. Other countries, who knows? But yeah, quantum computing has been kind of centered in the US for a long time. Other countries are doing really well as well in Europe. But we'll see. I don't think so. And again, this is one of the things, like, we can speculate on it, but
Yep.
so but what's the end conclusion, right? The end conclusion is, well, we should move to post quantum encryption.
Yeah. And if any surprises, we'll find out along the way. But
Right. I feel like then the project would have been sped up a lot faster already. Like if another country had the uh, quantum computer and the US knew about it, and I think it'd be very hard to not know about it. Like the encryption would have been sped up a lot, and if it was here on the inside, maybe we'd be getting a lot more pushback from NIST, but they've been on schedule so far. So I don't know. This is kind of maybe my view of the world, where I'm like, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. Though I have heard from security consultants that work with the government, they're like, yeah, we're further ahead than we think, but not to the point of like it's been around for 30 years and we're just wasting money and billions on this.
Well, I think any question goes. I mean, we're already at the intersection of multiple worlds and magic internet money, right? So I think that intersection probably maybe there's a little bit of conspiracy theorists that can't help but poke out every once in a while. Just I just when I'm thinking about it, I can't. If there was, we just wouldn't know, and if there wasn't, we just wouldn't know. So we just won't know.
Right.
But I'm curious. I do like to get. I do like to take a measurement on other people and see how they feel about it. I lean towards they probably have some innovations that commercial might not know about, and possibly the other way around. Optical quantum computing, I see a lot of funding going in. I don't see a lot of news coming out. I don't know if you've noticed that or if you've experienced something different.
It's been kind of a lull because again, the field is so small. I feel like the last 6 months, there's been a lot of news in quantum in general, but before that, for about a year, it's just kind of been dead. So the last 6 months, I was like, oh, finally, we've done something new. Like there's something new. We're not completely dead, but yeah, we had a lull for quite a bit, and I think there was just a lot of promise. And the problem with a small field, right, is that when people sell on hype and that hype dies off, that entire modality or technology or company just ends up kind of dying off in that way. And I think there's been some mistakes in the terms of messaging that companies, industries, and government has done, where this has turned a lot of people off of that and saying like, we're not going to get there to a certain point, but they can't admit that they're not, that there's still a lot of challenges. And I always very much, well, I mentioned to you all this Q2B conference that's really important in the field just because it's all of us getting together. And I always really appreciate that those insider conversations, because there's the marketing reports that come out, but then, we're sitting at lunch with a scientist and they're like, we don't know how to do this yet. And they're very straightforward about it. And they're saying like, yeah, we're building, but here's a legitimate challenge that we have. What are they going to publish in the meantime, right? Or do the news? They're like, we have to resolve this. And then all of a sudden they resolve it and you kind of get these little like hops of innovation. Oh, then this unlocks all these other things that we can do, right? But then for that while that they're pondering how to actually solve that, it's going to be quiet.
So to that point, I did hear some news today that I know you're a fan of Qiskit. IBM has a new version coming out next year. They have a new version coming out. I don't remember what the differences are going to be, but they're augmenting it with different ways that would allow a user to map a problem to a quantum form, translate it into quantum circuits, execute this quantum circuit, and process the results. I've heard you talk about that before. I've actually been. It's one of those things that if I can find the cycles, I've been meaning to get into a little bit more. Maybe I might have some questions for you after.
Definitely. It's a good kickstart language. They focused a lot on education very early on, and they were kind of the first out there. There's a few, so there's also Circ, there's also Penny Lane in terms of programming languages. So Penny Lane is focused a little bit on the ML side, which is a little bit of longer term application, but really has some interesting potential impacts. Circ is from Google, so they're working a little bit. They have that integration with like TensorFlow Quantum, some interesting things there. And then there's platforms coming out that are also trying to take even a step back from that programming and be like, okay, how do we enable domain experts to use quantum computers without having to understand it all, right? So like you shouldn't have to have that PhD in quantum physics and the domain expertise and everything else and know how to optimize the hardware to work on that. So Classic is a program there that does that. I've been looking at their stack a little bit, and it's really interesting. So there's a lot going on in this space, and I really like these educational technologies and projects because again, I think education is a big thing that's missing in this space, and more people need to get in the field. And I think also just going back to the question of like, why should we pay attention now? Right now, because quantum is so small, the algorithms that we have, the technology we have is limited to the brains of the people that have gone through a very specific program of study. what happens when you get into the hands of people that have a very different approach? They come from the biology pharma side, they come from the cryptography side. What are they going to unlock that we haven't seen because we just don't have the domain expertise? We just think in a different way. So once we get quantum computers in the hands of people, I only imagine there's going to be more interesting things coming out than just the basics. And I think even the basics are really interesting, the applications that we have so far.
Yeah. This kind of reminds me of like just in general with like, say, open source projects. Sometimes, you know, where an idea starts, it's like some of the innovation and great progress that can happen in open source sometimes is like just comes out of left field because someone comes at it from a different angle and they never otherwise wouldn't be able to contribute in that way. But that's one example. We could probably come up with tons of them. But no, you
Yeah.
bring up good point there.
There's definitely kind of a thin line in between, like, you know, it's interesting, right? It's people are coming to the field with fresh eyes, usually can provide a lot of good insight, but then there's like the other end that people come in from completely the opposite direction, right? Where you're just like, that's not even consistent with science that we have, and it's interesting to just deal with that, right? Because it's there was an article recently about the person that said he broke RSA 2048, right? Did you all see that?
Oh yeah, he and I
Is
had.
this the Arvix one from a while ago, or is it a different one?
No, he said like he said he had broken RSA 2048, and I had actually asked him about it on LinkedIn, and then he said it was something like only a dead fish swims downstream, and he started comparing quantum computers to salmon or something, and then I was like, okay.
So that's the thing about, like, you have to be open-minded. But I remember seeing that article. It was like, 6:30 in the morning. I looked at my phone, I saw it, and I was like, and I just rolled over and went back to bed because I was like it's probably not going to happen that way, right? I didn't realize that the media would pick it up, and then I get a lot of
Oh, the media
comments
will
being
pick
like,
anything up. Yeah.
That I think that's why, because the media picked it. That's why the article. That's why it exists.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because the double PhD supposedly uh, that comes with some credibility. I didn't do a background on him or anything, but it makes you wonder what some motives are at times. It I we were talking earlier about where we think some of the best innovations would come from, and I think you touched on this a little bit, Anastasia. And I just thinking about something. I think we need more young people in the field. Once you start to get uh, 30s, 40s, old like me, you just get very, very set in your ways, and it's just going to be that way. But the younger you are, the more adaptable you are to new ways of thinking. And right, my background, like I said, is very classical. But I forced myself down this path. I'm not sure I'm glad that I did, but the quantum path, the blockchain path, I'm good with. The quantum path, I'm not sure I'm entirely happy where I landed. But I think we need more young people that are more open-minded, because it takes a degree of open-mindedness. I'm not talking about blockchain. I'm just talking about quantum computers and quantum mechanics in general, to understand how reality is built, and the desire to want to do that. And you were talking about physics earlier. Unfortunately, that takes a series of steps to get there. I have to be interested in science. Then I have to be interested in physics. Then I have to go through. You almost have to go through the timeline, special relativity, general relativity, and then start to understand the double slit, and then start to ask, and then see the time delayed, the double split, and then start asking questions. You have to almost take a journey that takes time. Did you go? I'm curious. Did you go down a similar journey as I just described by connecting those dots, or did you just bam quantum? You just made it right to the finish line with a lot less work than I did. How did you get?
Yeah, so it's funny, you mentioned that you take steps. I remember I declared as a computer science major in college, and then I switched to bio, and then I switched to physics, and everyone told me, you're going the wrong direction. You're supposed to go to the easier ones. But I had less of that just because, I mean, my dad was a physicist, so I was raised in that way. And I mean, I went to math and science magnet school starting from high school, and there's a picture of me climbing on a cryostat when I was 4 years old. So I got very lucky with that upbringing.
Yeah, it got ingrained in you. So not only did you love it, but it was like it's kind of a nature and nurture type situation.
Nostalgic.
So
Yeah, it was kind of just like, oh, genetic lottery there of like family is a scientist,
Yeah, it's
and you
awesome.
just, and I also think about this a lot. Like in some ways, I'm just not very impressed with my journey, just because I have that background, right? Like I have people that supported that. Whereas I know a lot of, and I went to Georgia Tech, right, which is in the South. So there's people I knew my degree who were like, my parents don't believe in, like they believe the earth is 6,000 years old and dinosaurs, were planted, kind of thing. The fact that they found their way to physics, I'm just very, like, what a journey that is, that I just didn't have to go through. I was just always raised in a way where I was always tinkering, and I got to be around scientists all the time and their way of thinking, that it was a little bit of an easier leap for me. And for me, I also, to your point, you went that like special relativity route. I read The Elegant Universe when I was young, in high school, went through that. I liked it, but I actually came from the robotics side. I really loved working with my hands, being in the machine shop, drilling, that sort of thing. And I just wanted to work with my hands. So I went that direction, more so than the theory side.
And now you're working with something that you can't actually touch. If you
Yeah.
were, it would blue screen.
Yeah. It's always been that way though. But yeah, I mean, I did mention like I do have those moments in the lab, right, where I was like, I know this works, but at some point, when you're actually like taking the steps back in physics, you get to a point where you just have to take some things on faith, and people don't think about that. They search for the universal truth, and you're like we mentioned super determinism, right? It's at some point i I have this rule about, like, if I can't experimentally test it, you know it's not super fun for me to think about, because it's like I can speculate for a little bit, but then after that, like, where's the impact going to be, right? People talk about free will, right? It's like, well, okay, I can assume I don't have free will. What happens then? If I assume I don't have happen, maybe I'm not going to take actions to better my life or do certain things, or I take, bad actions and excuse it. So that's like a bad outcome, versus if I assume I have it but I don't, then like nothing, there's not a negative outcome there, right? So that's kind of my way, and it's like I'm gonna pick the one where I have the agency to move forward on.
And I'm sure all of us, and probably a lot of people watching this too, are we're optimistic, and we're people that want to be doers. So we want to have control and agency, as you mentioned, over things that we're doing. So it's like that's kind of a tug of war there a little bit. So
So I have to ask, do you have a preferred interpretation of quantum mechanics or not? Copenhagen, that's fine. Do you have a preferred one?
I think we
Or do you
talked
not
about
think
this
about it?
already. Yeah, I don't think about it. I go where it takes. I was taught Copenhagen interpretation. That was it. I'm always like curious and like open to conversations with that, but again, it's like, can it be experimentally tested in some way? And that's the thing with string theory, loop quantum gravity, all those things. I'm like,
That's-
okay, like,
We can't
let's
measure that.
test it.
We
Yeah. So
can't measure to the degree of accuracy that we need to be able to measure at in order to get those results that we want.
yep.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's so frustrating. Oh, I've got this great idea. Oh, not even Lego can do that. Jeez,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
which
Or there's
feels like we're going to be stuck for a long time in trying to get those answers that we really want. This could take 100, 200 more years to really get some sort of understanding as to what started with two slits and a candle. It's interesting.
Yeah, and there's the other side of it. There's also some theories where it's like, okay, well, even if this is true, it doesn't predict anything. So why should I, like, I'd rather go build than
I,
think about it.
I'm
Like,
a,
too hard, in the end, it doesn't really also matter.
That's fair. I'm a little different. I have to pick one eventually. I'm not going to say what it is right now. Maybe in a future conversation. But it's kind of a blend of something I. It's kind of a blend of something I came up with, and something else. I'm still researching to see how much they match. But yeah, there is in academic, there is a strong push I've seen at times, Stop asking questions. Shut up and calculate. Is what I've heard. Is what I've heard a lot. There's a big part of me that thinks more questions need to be asked, but that also, to your point, it can be a trade-off with productivity. Fortunately, I have my classical career and other things that I can waste time thinking about quantum causality and isolated quantum systems, and how entanglement entanglement actually does make sense. But I think we've reached the end here, Ryan.
Yeah, no, I think I just had like two other quick questions as like a wrap up. I think the one, I'm going to circle back to what we discussed earlier in the conversation around, you mentioned it was around whatever, 2009. You went down in the deep end in terms of like the startup scene. You mentioned being involved with Rigetti there. I'd be curious to know, I know just in general, obviously Silicon Valley, there's a lot of innovation happening there, both in the physical space of that whole area, and also just, Silicon Valley, just the, idea of it digitally. But one question I want to ask is, there's a lot of forward thinkers and people that are trying to see, 10 years down the road, what the world will look like. I'd be curious to hear maybe a funny story or two, or maybe just one that something you found surprising, whether it was just, VCs that were just so opposed to the idea of what you're after, in that time period, 14, 15 years ago, or even maybe ones that saw the future, and from 2009 and looking back in hindsight, it makes sense. But at that time it seemed bold. So this is an open-ended question. Maybe if there's just a fun story or two you have around, being in the weeds as a practitioner during that time period. I think everyone listening would like to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, no one was investing in quantum 2009. That was my educational tech story. But yeah, the VC market started where I was having the conversations had started 2014, 2015, 2013. I talked about to some folks on the internal end. Don't know if there's any funny VC story. I mean, it was just a mess back then, right? So one thing that's changed is like you could just like dazzle them back in the day in 2014 and just be like quantum. And it kind of worked out, right? Because
they got that FOMO. They've already wired you with the wiring instructions. Yeah.
Exactly. So that definitely happened. It's a funny story actually. So Northrop Grumman has been involved in quantum for a very, very long time. I don't know if a lot of people know that. So I met one of the heads of the department back in graduate school, and actually one of the funny story there was we've had to really evolve as human beings. You know that XKCD, that's like, whatever majors are annoying, but there's nothing worse than a physics major learning something for the first time. Like, that's really how the last 10 years I've been in physics, being like, hey, other people actually have good ideas and good insights, and we need to actually work together. So this person I met who was head of this quantum department at Northrop Grumman, he said he came from a math and engineering background, but physicists report to him. And he's like, you guys are some of the most like frustrating people in the world, but I've learned how to talk to you all. He's like, I go into a meeting and I talk to you and I go, is this possible? And you guys respond.
It depends.
Well, no, they respond, yes, if it's possible, like before the heat death of the universe happens. And he's like, if it's by physical laws possible, the physicist will say, yes, it's possible. He's like, okay, is it possible within the next year with this amount of funding? And he has to like just like take the physicist step by step of like, okay, let's set more constraints, because if the universe allows it, then you're going to say yes, and then we're going to go down this road of projects that
non-zero probability. I think people like that one. That's a little more socially then it's a little socially more correct than heat death of the universe.
Yeah. But scientists in general do this a lot, right? And I think that's why the press itself sometimes like really gets down on scientists, because we'll never say anything is 100% true.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
And so they're like, well, they're unsure. Like they don't actually know. It's not actually going to work. And that's why they're hedging. And it's like, you're just taught in that way of like, you can't know everything in the universe ever.
Law of probability over infinite time, because that's what we're thinking. If
Yeah.
there's even the smallest amount of chance, law of probability, it'll eventually happen, right? Yeah. If you take an apple and put it in a vacuum furnace, and over years and eons, it disintegrates and things like that. Eventually, there will become a state where that apple gets put back together again, and the math shows this. The Earth may be long and gone by then, but over infinite time, assuming time is infinite, yes. So I'm not sure if I'm on your side or the scientist side of what they just said. I guess maybe I'm bridging the gap between the two, but I get the narrative.
Exactly.
Thanks for sharing that, Anastasia. I
Yeah,
feel like
you.
you'll probably talk on other random, side tangents of that for a bit, but as kind of like a wrap up question, I'm sure we could have a part 2 conversation and jump into all other sorts of areas that are fun to talk about. But just as a closing out one for today, for those that are watching that aren't already familiar with your content, as a overlap with our channels and kind of their interests, where's maybe a good place or places for community members within our QRL community that are watching our stuff, that for them to follow your content? YouTube, Twitter, what's your best place for them to have as a starting point, and then they can jump down the content rabbit hole from there?
Definitely. All of the above. So I just say go to my website because everything is linked there, amarchenkova.com. And then I have my link to my YouTube, my TikTok, because I'm the crazy person that thought teaching quantum on TikTok would be a reasonable thing. Made a lot of friends doing that. My Twitter, Instagram. I'm experimenting, content.
Yeah, you gotta.
Content is kind of fun. So
Yeah,
all the
it's one of
platforms are
those
different.
things.
We'll put the links in the description about that.
Yeah. I'll put all those into the show notes below. And Anastasia, just really enjoyed myself, Michael, enjoyed the conversation. I feel like it's nice that we're able to have a conversation with you kind of from like a high level, but then we can really at any point just drop down into the weeds. Because I think one important thing that a lot of people, whether we're talking to friends, family members, a stranger that we walk by in the street, a lot of people think about this idea of quantum computing and they think, oh, I know what that is. That's this big machine in the middle of a big room in Washington, D.C., which sure, that might be the case in a few instances, but people don't actually think about the aspects of there's real people working on all of this technology and are tangibly touching it in much more tangible parts of touching it physically, digitally, like with the code as well. And so I just really enjoy having this conversation and bringing it down to, to ground level for people. And then they can, choose their rabbit hole as they see fit. But really appreciate the conversation. I like you make quantum and, tech approachable, and enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was a great conversation. Usually I get the same questions over and over, and this was an amazing discussion. And to your point, there's real people working on this. We have silly problems. Next time I'll tell the story about the sunbeam that ruined 2 weeks of work because apparently the water chiller was in the way of the sunbeam, and that ruins coherence time. So that's the problems we're facing day to day in the quantum space.
Well, we're going to leave it at there. And until next time, everyone watching, have a great rest of the day, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks, Anastasia. Thank you.